Living alone has its perks: peace, quiet, and the freedom to do as I please. My small, cozy house had always been a sanctuary for me, a place where I could escape the chaos of the outside world. But there are also those nights when the solitude turns into something else, something darker. It started as a night like any other. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to unwinding with a glass of wine and a good book. The routine was comforting: a warm shower, soft pajamas, and the familiar creaks of the house settling as the day faded into night. My armchair by the large window was my favorite spot, a perfect vantage point to watch the quiet street and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. The room was softly illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp beside me. Outside, the world was shrouded in darkness, the only movement the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I took a deep sip of my wine and settled into the familiar rhythm of my book, the pages turning with a soft rustle. As the hours passed, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, like a tickle at the back of my neck. I shook it off, attributing it to the effects of a long day. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I could no longer concentrate on the words of my book. It was as if the shadows in the room were shifting, whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I paused, listening intently to the silence that had settled over the house. It was a silence so complete that it seemed almost unnatural. My mind raced through all the logical explanations: the wind rustling outside, the house settling into its foundations, maybe even a stray cat making its way through the neighborhood. Yet none of these thoughts could shake the growing sense of unease. Then I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the back of the house. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. My heart skipped a beat as I listened, the sound growing more distinct. It was coming from the back of the house. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the tapping grew louder, more urgent, as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked cautiously toward the back of the house. The sound was now accompanied by a series of heavy footsteps. The noise seemed to be coming from the direction of the back door, which led to the small, overgrown backyard. As I approached the door, I noticed an unsettling detail. The tapping sound seemed to be synchronized with the footsteps, as if whoever was making them was deliberately pacing in rhythm. My breath quickened, and I hesitated before opening the door. The unsettling feeling in my stomach was growing, but curiosity and fear pushed me forward. The night air hit me with a cold, damp embrace. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, the shadows of the overgrown bushes and trees stretching long across the grass. I scanned the area, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. The footsteps had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to weigh heavily on my shoulders. The ground beneath my feet felt oddly soft and damp, as if someone had been moving around recently. I moved cautiously toward the old oak tree at the far end of the yard, where the footsteps had been heading. The tree's gnarled branches loomed ominously in the moonlight. As I approached the tree, the tapping sound returned, more insistent now, coming from behind the trunk. I edged closer, my hands trembling as I peered around the trunk. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, partially hidden in the shadows, was a shadowy figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its features obscured by the darkness. The figure seemed to be crouched or hunched over, and its movements were jerky, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my gaze never leaving the figure. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, raspy breathing that seemed to come from all around me. I could feel the presence of something malevolent, something that didn't belong in the quiet, peaceful night. I turned and ran back toward the house, my footsteps pounding against the ground as I fumbled to get the back door open. The door finally swung shut behind me, but the feeling of dread didn't lift. I locked the door and closed the curtains, shutting out the night. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a dark presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. I tried to return to my book, but the words swam before my eyes, and the shadows in the room seemed to close in tighter with every passing minute. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, seemed to echo with the remnants of that strange, unsettling encounter. The night dragged on, and as the hours passed, the house seemed to come alive with sounds I couldn't quite place. I heard faint whispers and rustling noises that seemed to move from room to room. The silence that had once been so comforting now felt oppressive and filled with hidden threats. The tapping sound, though no longer present, seemed to echo in the recesses of my mind, mingling with the other strange noises. The walls themselves seemed to be alive with an unsettling energy. Shadows danced across the room, not with the gentle sway of a flickering candle, but with a deliberate, mocking rhythm. The occasional creak of the floorboards made me jump, each sound amplified by the heightened sense of dread. I considered calling the police but dismissed the idea, knowing how absurd it would sound. Strange tapping noises and shadowy figures. What would they think? I was alone, and it was my word against the silence of the night. I decided to check the entire house, hoping that seeing everything in the light would dispel the fear. I turned on every light, even the dim lamps in the hallway. The house, of course, was empty. Every corner was just as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the eerie feeling persisted. The quiet seemed to press in on me, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The hours crawled by. I tried to sleep, but every rustle and creak seemed magnified, a reminder of the night's events. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the images of the shadowy figure and the strange noises. The thought of the figure lurking outside, watching me through the windows, made it impossible to relax. As dawn finally broke, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. The first light of day seemed to push back the shadows, but the events of the night had left their mark. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a place of lurking dread, its shadows hiding more than just the darkness of the night. I had always relished the quiet of the night. It was the perfect time for studying. My parents had long since gone to bed, their footsteps fading down the hall as they retreated to their room. The house was wrapped in a peaceful silence that I cherished, a backdrop to my late-night study sessions. It was approaching midnight when I first heard it. At first, it was a subtle sound, barely noticeable over the hum of my desk lamp. A soft, scratching noise seemed to drift from somewhere within the house. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, a benign creak or groan of the old wooden beams. But then it came again, clearer, more deliberate. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to make noise without drawing attention. My heart began to race. I glanced at the clock. 12:42 a.m. The noise persisted, a dragging sound followed by a faint thud, like something heavy being moved across the floor. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing, but the sounds grew louder and more insistent. I decided to investigate. I didn't want to wake my parents. They needed their rest, and I didn't want to alarm them over what could be a harmless noise. I stepped out of my room, careful to tread quietly. The house was dimly lit by the faint light coming from the moon outside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sound seemed to be coming from downstairs. I carefully made my way to the top of the staircase, listening intently. The scraping sound was now louder, accompanied by an unsettling silence that seemed to press down on me. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. I slowly descended the stairs, each step creaking softly under my weight. The noises were coming from the living room, so I moved cautiously toward it. The room was darker than the rest of the house, with only the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. The coffee table was slightly askew, as though it had been moved recently. The lamp on the side table flickered intermittently, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and looked around. The noises had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of unease persisted. I moved toward the hallway that led to the back rooms. The scratching sound had stopped, but a strange, faint rustling noise had taken its place. It was as though someone or something was moving just out of sight. My pulse quickened as I walked cautiously down the hallway. The hallway was empty, but the rustling noise was louder now, coming from one of the back rooms. I approached the door of my parents' bedroom, which was slightly ajar. I peered inside, but the room was dark and empty. My parents were sound asleep, their breathing steady and calm. The sound seemed to be coming from elsewhere. I backed away slowly, feeling an intense sense of being watched. The noise grew fainter, as if whoever or whatever was making it was moving away from me. I turned around and hurried back to the living room, but the eerie silence remained. The feeling of unease was overwhelming, and I knew I needed to get back to my room. Back in my room, I locked the door and turned off the lights. The noises had ceased, but my mind was racing with the unsettling feeling of being watched. I tried to return to my studies, but the darkness of the night seemed oppressive, filled with shadows that held secrets I couldn't understand. As the night dragged on, I remained tense and alert, every creak of the house making me jump. The quiet that once comforted me now felt heavy and suffocating, a reminder of the strange noises and the unsettling presence I had sensed. When morning came, everything seemed normal again. My parents were oblivious to the disturbance, and the house was calm. But the memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder of the shadows that lurked just beyond the edges of my understanding. The quiet had become a dark, unsettling presence, and I knew that the night would never feel the same again. It was the kind of night that felt different from any other. Thicker, heavier. My parents had left for an evening event, promising to return before midnight. They'd left me alone in the house, a place that usually felt safe and comforting. But tonight, every creak and groan of the old house seemed to carry an ominous weight. After they departed, I found myself wandering through the rooms, seeking some semblance of normalcy. The living room, with its large windows overlooking the street, seemed to be the only place where the night's unsettling ambiance couldn't intrude. I settled on the couch, trying to distract myself with TV shows on my phone, but the faintest of noises made me jump. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional thud and creak. The air felt dense, almost like it was pressing against me. I turned off my phone and listened to the sounds of the house. Each creak and groan seemed amplified, filling the void left by the silence. My anxiety grew with each passing minute, and I tried to distract myself by lighting a few candles I found in the kitchen. As I arranged the candles around the living room, I noticed a sudden chill that seemed to permeate the space. I tried to dismiss it, blaming the old windows and drafty house. Yet, the sensation clung to me, making the hairs in the back of my neck stand on end. Deciding to make myself some hot chocolate, I ventured into the kitchen. The soft light from the candles cast long shadows on the walls, distorting the familiar space into something strange and unsettling. The refrigerator hummed quietly, a rare sound in the otherwise still house. I poured milk into a saucepan and turned on the stove, trying to ignore the creeping unease. As I waited for the milk to heat, I heard it, a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, almost like someone was pacing back and forth in one of the rooms. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it as the house settling or perhaps a trick of my imagination, but the sound persisted. With a growing sense of dread, I finished making the hot chocolate and took it with me as I made my way upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit by the soft glow of the candles I had left burning. Each step I took seemed louder in the silence, and the rhythmic thumping grew more pronounced as I approached the top of the stairs. I tried the door to my parents' bedroom first. It was locked, as always. I moved to the guest room across the hall, where the thumping seemed to be coming from. The door was ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering candles downstairs. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The thumping had stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The bed was undisturbed, the dresser stood silent, and the closet door was slightly ajar. My instinct screamed at me to leave the room, but curiosity drew me to the closet. I pulled the door open, revealing a clutter of old clothes and boxes. The thumping noise had ceased, and the room seemed as empty as before. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I scanned the closet. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of foreboding was impossible to ignore. I retreated from the room, my heart pounding. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise had been. I went back downstairs, trying to calm myself with the comforting warmth of the hot chocolate and the flickering light of the candles. Yet the feeling of unease lingered, wrapping itself around me like a cold embrace. It was then that I heard it again, clearer and closer. The sound was coming from the basement. The basement had always been a place of dread for me. Dark, musty, and filled with forgotten relics. I had avoided it for as long as I could, but the persistent noise drove me to investigate. I approached the basement door at the end of the hallway, the wooden steps leading down to darkness. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the blackness, and I hesitated before opening the door. The air that greeted me was colder, carrying a faint, unpleasant smell. I descended the steps, each creak of the wooden stairs echoing through the stillness. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was a void of shadows. My phone's light barely illuminated the space, revealing old furniture and boxes piled haphazardly. The noise had stopped, but the oppressive silence was almost worse. I fumbled for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging me into deeper darkness. I moved cautiously through the basement, the faint glow from my phone casting eerie shapes on the walls. The thumping noise had ceased, but I felt as though I was being watched. My breath quickened, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the basement, and I nearly dropped my phone in shock. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the noise. The basement was filled with old furniture, boxes, and dust-covered items. My flashlight revealed nothing unusual, but the crash had come from somewhere in the clutter. I noticed an old, battered chest in the corner of the room. It was partially obscured by a stack of boxes. The chest was covered in dust and cobwebs, its surface worn with age. I approached it cautiously, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. As I drew closer, the air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift. I reached out and touched the chest, its surface cold and heavy. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of old photographs, letters, and trinkets. The items were dusty and covered in a layer of grime. At the bottom of the chest, I found a small, intricately carved box. It was old and heavy, its surface etched with strange symbols. As I picked up the box, a chill ran down my spine. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the basement seemed to close in. I quickly set the box back in the chest and closed the lid. The noise had stopped, but the sense of unease was more profound than before. I hurried back upstairs, my mind racing with the possibilities of what I had discovered. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and restless pacing. The feeling of being watched never left me, and the silence of the house was suffocating. When my parents finally returned, they found me on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, my nerves frayed. I didn't mention the noises or the chest in the basement. They reassured me with their presence and laughter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. To this day, I avoid the basement, and the memory of that night haunts me. I never found an explanation for the noises or the strange box. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a labyrinth of shadows and fears. The darkness of that night remains a reminder of how something as ordinary as being home alone can become a terrifying ordeal when the silence is filled with the unknown.